what is permaculture versus what is regenerative. And, there is not one answer to that question.
But I said, this is the result of permaculture thinking. This is the result of rigorous application of permaculture.
Right? But if I'm talking about permaculture versus regeneration, I almost just think of it as a way to talk around the same thing to certain people.
Hello and welcome to the Permaculture Vine podcast, where we talk about careers, education and business. Today we have a special roundtable with three special guests. So do you want to just introduce yourselves there? Sarah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm Sarah Spencer. I'm founder of Think Like a Tree and Think Like a Forest, and that kind of has taken permaculture to this regenerative next level with regard to individuals and also kind of designing their own lives and businesses and organizations that I support as well.
Great stuff, Christopher.
Good day. My name is Christopher Nesbitt, and my wife Celini and I manage the Maya Mountain Research Farm, and we mostly work in agroforestry and renewable energy. Yeah.
Great. Joshua?
Yeah, Joshua Prieto, co-founder of Seeds of Dow, and we are a education and support platform for regenerative entrepreneurs.
And I'm Cormac, the host, and Vine Permaculture, and we're a design and education company now, I suppose. So this podcast today is about regenerative design versus permaculture design. Sarah, do you want to kick it off there, please?
Because you and I were kind of thinking about potential topics that might be of interest, and one thing that I wrote an article on LinkedIn a little while ago that got quite a bit of interest, which was comparing, just my take on what is permaculture versus what is regenerative. And, there is not one answer to that question. Hence why it was an article on LinkedIn that had lots of engagement, and people can check that out, obviously, to add their own views and comments. But I think it is really fascinating because we're hearing obviously more and more the term regenerative being used, especially in the context of maybe businesses stepping into this idea of a different way to live on this planet. And then we've also got permaculture, which has been around for a very long time, really tried and tested as a design process, largely associated with gardens and growing, but perhaps misinterpreted as that. So, on the one hand, you've got permaculture design, and then you've got this perhaps misconception that that's just about designing land. And then on the other hand, you've got regenerative approaches, which can mean quite a lot of things, including can be greenwashed to a certain extent. So, we are now seeing big companies using the word regenerative where they wouldn't fit what I would suggest might be, the definition. And you can read more in the article as well. But, for me, both of these approaches are living systems approaches. And sometimes we don't talk about permaculture in that sense, but essentially what the permaculture principles are principles that we can observe in nature, and then we mimic that in our designs. So whether that be a design for a garden, say, and I started in land-based permaculture design. For my own garden, I've got kind of a small holding here in South Derbyshire, and the same is true for regenerative as well. So it is a living systems approach. It doesn't have a kind of set of principles per se. Each practitioner perhaps has their slightly different, each training provider as well, a slightly different sort of set of principles, but essentially they have that in common. And permaculture is also a design process. So you go step by step through a process. And in regenerative, you may or may not do that. It may it may be, so in some cases with regenerative leadership, for example, it may not be a process, it might be a way of being. And so in regenerative, perhaps more so than in permaculture, we tend to talk about a shift in paradigm, in mindset, so that we're actually really inhabiting this living systems way of being in the whole world, rather than permaculture, which might be, you might kind of think, oh, I can permaculture my garden, but am I actually living in those principles in my life in its totality? Now that is, I realize there's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot of kind of nuance, and I know that, you know, Josh and Christopher will you know, deepen that. But anyway, that's starting us off to perhaps give an idea of perhaps the complexity of this topic and the richness of it, really.
Hey, Cormac, I can't hear you.
Sorry. It's World War III here in a minute, so I had to turn my mic off. I'll edit that out. Josh, do you want to go next there?
Yeah, no, I love getting us started on this, Sarah, and for the article, and I really do share a lot of similar thoughts. The one thing that I would kind of add to this is like, I like to use all the words. I started off using more permaculture design in a lot of ways, and I've told this to a lot of people. Maybe I've had this conversation with you as well, Sarah, but like permaculture was really where my introductory point was in as far as terminology, right? I kind of fell into this space through the natural building and earthen building world, and then realized that they were very much related. And then I started recognizing all of these things that we're building or designing in right relation to nature. And that's kind of where I kind of group all of this, right? I think of circular economics, donut economics, regenerative economics, and business and design, all in that same vein. And I think it's where I usually have more conversation in is sustainability versus regeneration in a lot of ways, right? But if I'm talking about permaculture versus regeneration, I almost just think of it as a way to talk around the same thing to certain people, right? So I started using regeneration in a lot of ways for that ability to talk to more people, to broaden the thought of what essentially I was talking about to people that were permaculture. And permaculture kind of got this rap of, you know, very fringe culture in a lot of ways, like hippie movement, right? And I noticed that, and I was all about permaculture, but when I would started talking to a certain group of people, they would shut off, right? And I wasn't able to talk to them. So I started using regeneration. And that's when I felt like I was able to open up some doors in that conversation. So for me, it's more about, you're using the same principles in a lot of these spaces, and you're actually just being able to adapt in saying the right words at the right time for the right people. And I'm also a marketer, and so that's really what it is for me. It's like I got to use all the words, and I got to figure out when I'm speaking French to the French person, Spanish to the Spanish person, Greek to the Greeks, right? And that's kind of what it is in this space. Like, and I do agree in a lot of ways, Sarah, when you're mentioning, like, on the regenerative side, it's a lot easier to greenwash the regenerative movement than I think it was the permaculture movement, because it was so fringe, right? And there's a reason, you know, like, people didn't want to greenwash permaculture and haven't really greenwashed it in a lot of ways, even though there's still some of that. But regeneration is very much easier to talk about, and therefore easier for people to maybe take advantage of, or say that they're regenerative when they're really not doing regenerative work, right? So those are my initial thoughts, and would love to get your thoughts, Chris, and just kind of have a discussion around this with all of us.
Yeah, so my experience mirrors both of your experiences. Certainly, I was invited to give a presentation at Yale School of Forestry and by a friend of mine, Catherine Kata Young, who was a former student at my farm many years ago, and then went back to school. And she's absolutely amazing human being. And she talked about how permaculture is considered fringe in academia, and part of it is because as an uncredentialed discipline, there's a lot of people who take a permaculture design course and hang up a shingle as being permaculture gurus, and we have sort of the run the gamut from left to right of sort of permaculture Marxists and left-leaning people like myself. And then you've got sort of the right-wing permaculture survivalist set kind of mentality, which also bleeds over into the regenerative agriculture movement. There's more of that in there, my opinion, my experience. So I was there. I didn't talk about permaculture so much because I was focused on agroforestry. I was invited to a conference, the Moses Conference in Wisconsin a few years ago, and they said permaculture is really fringe, and you know, you're going to get kickback. And so I gave my presentation. I talked about permaculture. It was a slideshow, and I had lots of photographs of what we were doing. And I said, okay, so you see, everything that you've seen was informed by rigorous application of the permaculture principles. And I didn't go into the ethics because the ethics are so esoteric to so many people. But at that moment, but I said, you know, this is the result of permaculture thinking. This is the result of rigorous application of permaculture principles. So to me, for years, I avoided using the term permaculture for the same reasons that, you know, you mentioned, Joshua, in part because it just, people's eyes would glaze over, like, oh yeah, okay, you know, and it's sort of the hippie connotations. But now I kind of embrace it because I think that I'm grateful with the education I got in my permaculture design course, and which gave me a framework to look at what I'm doing. I've managed to do something that's actually working pretty well. So just some of my thoughts. And the other thing with the regenerative movement is I've seen a lot of what I would call shitty practices. I haven't witnessed them in person, read about them online, being called regenerative. And it's sort of like, yeah, okay, I see that's like getting hit on the head with a smaller stick, but you're still getting hit on the head. Yeah, that's sort of my take.
So is that a couple of problems then, the the greenwashing and the ESG scores, you know, as a measure of how regenerative you are or how environmentally friendly you are? I think then it's like Coca-Cola have a better ESG score than Tesla, which is supposed to be environmentally friendly. So how do you combat that greenwashing? I was chatting to someone the other day who mentioned that there is no, I think you mentioned it there, Sarah, as well, there is no defining principles for regenerative. Would that make it easier?
There has been talk of it. I think there's been generalized consensus that it's not either necessary or desirable. But I personally think the way for that and permaculture, you know, to keep their integrity is for it always to have that living systems approach, like Josh was saying, you know, being aligned with life, that kind of approach front and center. And it's also one of the reasons why I've chosen to have all of my courses and offerings with quite a heavy dose of nature connection, as well as learning from nature. Because what I've noticed sometimes, even with permaculture, but more so with some of regenerative practices like regenerative economics or regenerative leadership, some strands of it, is that we have these principles, and then it's like they're there in the abstract in some fancy diagram. And in my mind, if I can take a team or a leader out into a forest and say, show me the circular economy in the forest, you kind of can't greenwash that, really. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? It's like you can see the circular economy happening in the forest, and you can really, really clearly compare that with, you know, the waste, the pollution, the totally opposite practices, extractiveness that we see in human industrial society, and then contrast that with a forest. So that kind of resists greenwashing to a certain extent, because it's a bit like the emperor's new clothes. You know, you can say, okay, so you say that's regenerative, show me where you can demonstrate that happening in a living system. So and I also find that also helps people engage the heart, because one of the things that it does tend to come across quite well, I think, in a lot of regenerative practices, is that this isn't just a way of thinking, it is a way of, you need to engage your heart and your love, and you know, your love of the earth, and that again has a certain, when you get enough people engaging with that, it becomes really clear when somebody's trying to exploit it just for pure financial gain.
Yeah, I think it's important to even add in, like, what we're trying to define, you know, the difference between permaculture and regeneration. And there's definitions of permaculture that people have that are kind of wide and varied, and there's definitions of regeneration that people are wide people are wide and varied on as well. I think that's the same with greenwashing, and so, you know, I've had people say, "Oh, that's greenwashing." And where I was like, you know what? I think that's still regenerative. It's a system where it's moving us towards more regenerative work, but it in many ways, we're all, to some extent, not, we can't be purists in a system that is completely tainted with degenerative and extractive work in a lot of ways, right? And industry. And so I think it's important to maybe even define what that greenwashing is. And to me, when I look at greenwashing, it usually comes down to two things. It comes down to authenticity and transparency, right? If you're authentically trying to move towards that new future of a regenerative economy, which no one's really living in at this moment, unless you're off living in the jungle all on your own and self-sufficient and living in right relation with nature that way, right? Which means you're not engaging with the rest of the world in most ways. And I tried doing that on an off-grid farmstead. I tried doing that, which was not essentially the way for me to go, right? Or on the other side, it's transparency, because when you look at, and if you think of greenwashing and sustainability, where it kind of first got its limelight, they're greenwashing, or that person's greenwashing, it was usually big businesses kind of painting this illusion of something that was green, and it really wasn't. And so it was them not being transparent and them not being really truly authentic, because they weren't really doing green things or doing you know, and I think it's the same for regeneration and permaculture in a lot of ways. I think we see more regenerative greenwashing than we do permaculture, for the reason that it is more compelling and interesting for bigger businesses and businesses that do want to just cover themselves up and make them look green, when they're not doing good things, when they actually know that they're not being authentic. And they're not being transparent about that as well. They're just covering it up with some green paint, essentially, right? So for me, that's the definition of greenwashing. I just wanted to kind of clarify that as we kind of explore this a little bit more.
Christopher, anything they follow there?
Well, yeah, I think that is one of the big issues, that we see the difference between the two. And number one, permaculture, there's not a whole bunch of commercial agriculture that self-identifies as permaculture. You can't go to the shop and buy your permaculture apricots and your permaculture bananas imported from wherever. But you can go buy stuff that's allegedly regenerative, and you know, some of the think General Mills had a thing on regenerative a while ago, or Nestle actually had a bunch of really great pamphlets on regenerative agriculture. And if you didn't see the little Nestle logo in the lower left corner, you would you would be like, oh, this is really cool. And you're like, oh yeah, okay, greenwashing by definition. So I think that one of the differences is harder to co-opt permaculture for commercial, other than giving courses and whatnot. But in terms of marketing commodities, most permaculture farmers tend to be fairly small unless you have a bunch of them in close proximity together where you can do centralized purchasing and distribution. There's not really a way to sort of access the quantities you need for the level of production where greenwashing might be desirable or possible even. While regenerative, General Mills committed to, or regenerative agriculture in your, we're using less Roundup or whatever. I mean, I'm just examples. And so one of the differences I see in permaculture is largely self-governing and self-regulating in that. And regenerative agriculture is broad enough that there's a lot of stuff going on in there, some of which is very good, and some of which is not really good. And the term itself is sometimes meaningless. Regenerative doesn't, to me, because I've seen, people who are doing what I consider to be crummy agriculture, under the banner regenerative agriculture. So yeah, just
yeah, I kind of want to come back to the whole concept of design here as well, because I think often when I see regenerative agriculture, it's got a really big focus on soil, and there's obviously a big focus on maybe where livestock's involved, mimicking those natural ways that nature manages land, if you like, and those really core principles are being seen in that process when it's done well, obviously. But with permaculture, what I think it's a shame if people move beyond permaculture and then kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you like, because the design process itself is so incredibly powerful. And you can mimic nature, but actually permaculture gives you a huge set of tools about what how what would you do first. You do your site survey first. You wouldn't just see a field and say, okay, I'm going to build the soil there, let's put some rotational grazing on it. You would stand back, you do that observation process that starts with every good permaculture design starts with observation, and you then look at absolutely every aspect of that design. So you'd look at where the different elements of the design are going to be placed. You look at your zones. So obviously you've got a concept of zones within permaculture, that you put things that need more effort and energy nearer to your house, for example, and you design that way. You're designing for multiple yields, you're designing for resilience. All of these things, when you follow a really good permaculture design process step by step, and then record that, revisit it, tweak it, keep it alive, that's where I think the real magic of permaculture is. And I think that's quite often being lost when people then transition to other regenerative practices. And that's perhaps because you really do need to, at the very least, have done a permaculture design certificate, if not then proceeded on to the diploma or other form of multiple designing, to just try and get into that habit of design being a part of your life and everything that you do.
This might sound like a silly question, but if I'm a permaculture designer, right, how do I become a regenerative designer? It's like if I'm a regenerative designer, I'm still using the permaculture principles. But are you saying that that's just a term that it's just was that?
I'll just interject that I think that permaculture tends to be regenerative anyway, without the I don't know, without the terminology behind it. You know, if you go into any established permaculture system and think what was here before then, and I know in the case of my farm, so I bought a degraded citrus and cattle farm back in the 1980s. It was super cheap because it was super messed up, and I was too stupid to know any better. And now you go to the farm. The picture behind me is a section of my farm from about 10 years ago. We've got a whole bunch of different trees. We've got subcanopy species, etc. So permaculture is going to step in and be better than what was there before it, if it's rigorously applied using the principles. One of the differences between the permaculture and regenerative is probably going to be a species count. I mean, permaculture farmers are more likely to have multiple different species and think long and intensively about associated plant guilds, et cetera, while regenerative farmers, from the ones that, again, I have not actually seen any because I'm a little bit socially and culturally and geographically isolated, they're more focused on kilograms per hectare times dollar value per kilogram, which is fine. I mean, you know, farming is a business, and it's good that some people are able to do something better than bad and make money doing it. So yeah, I think that part of the difference is going to be that the permaculture itself is likely to result in something that's very more complex and sort of long-term than regenerative. They have regenerative annual cropping of grains, and that, you know, which is fine. It's probably better than what they replaced it with, but it doesn't significantly improve things. Well, no, I should say it does significantly improve things if done properly. But it's still spinning your tires. It's still like trying to maintain something instead of transforming. Yeah.
Yeah, I can resonate with that, and I think that kind of going back to that question, can you go from permaculture design into regenerative design, or what is that kind of dynamic? I think you're right. Like permaculture is really going to be regenerative. I'm not sure that regenerative always relates to permaculture in every sense, right? But there is, and it's almost the same like when we look at like sustainability. Maybe there's a spectrum on this that we're kind of alluding to a little bit of like, when I look at sustainability, I look at as mostly hospice work, right? Where we're really trying to get a dying system to die out gradually in a way that doesn't ruin everything else around it, right? Or destroy economies and the ways of living that we're currently in, but to actually see it gracefully fall away. And that's kind of what I look at sustainable practices, is trying to butt up against, you know, less. It's a less bad thing, and we're trying to get less and less bad. And regeneration kind of is in a lot of ways somewhat of a bridge to allowing us to start thinking more, designing in specific ways that are in right relation to nature. And to be honest, there's some people that, and for me, I kind of look at it that way. I got my design certificate. I wouldn't say that I've done a few land-based designs, but most of my work has been in trying to design invisible systems, right? Trying to design for, and it's a lot of social permaculture, if we're going to use that term, right? And I think a lot of social permaculture butts up into kind of the regenerative world, where you're trying to interact with systems that are failing or not working, and trying to make sure that we can redesign those systems in such a way that it's new. It's not something that's based on that old system, but there is that kind of, you have to actually be working in this world and not completely isolate it if you're going to try to change some of those invisible systems, right, that are at play. and they are living systems in themselves. We don't see them, you know, like our cultural systems and everything else. It is a lot of mindset shift, moving us towards a new type of doing things, right? So yeah, that's kind of my thought on it. Is it kind of a spectrum? And I believe regeneration acts as a good bridge for us to talk to and be able to bring in more and more people in ways that are trying to move towards right relation to nature. Because I think really most of us, even if we haven't heard the word regeneration or permaculture, we believe that nature does have a good solution for us, and that we can and that we want to live in right relation with it, right? I would say the majority of us would say that when it comes down to it. Even someone that is very much, you know, living in suburbia, doesn't really have any thought of it, but then goes out in nature and really just enjoys the way their higher powers kind of built this environment for them, right? So that's my 2 cents on maybe that, maybe possibly this being regeneration or regenerative design kind of being a bridge and a way for us to attach it to some of these invisible structures that are very much limiting in a lot of ways, like our culture, our society, the governance models, and those types of things, right?
Yeah, I'd like to really kind of build on what you're saying there, Josh, about the social permaculture, kind of the people side, because really it was the underdeveloped ethic in the permaculture ethics. So we've got obviously earth care, people care, fair shares, and the second two really were, and I would argue still are, kind of underdeveloped. And actually those are really where we see the problems. So we see those problems arising in permaculture projects because often it's not anything to do with the land or the design of the land that causes a permaculture project to fail. It's usually some kind of conflict with the people, or, you know, some kind of people focused element of a project. And then obviously on a global scale, what the regenerative leadership, business, economics approaches really do very well is explore the different worldviews and mindsets that have led us to the extremes of extraction that we've got in our world. So you know, the charting the history of what's often called the story of separation. So how did humans go from living largely in right relationship with nature, you know, over hundreds of thousands of years, that went to these extremes where we're impacting the planet. You know, we've destroyed, you know, huge amounts of biodiversity, and things are heading in a really dire situation. The reason for that is that the stories that we tell ourselves about how the world works are fundamentally flawed, and that isn't often mentioned in permaculture teaching very much. It is very much front and center, in my experience of regenerative teaching. And I think with permaculture, one of the reasons is that actually a lot of people come to that conclusion quite naturally when they work with the land. They build that relationship, you know, by having their hands in the soil and loving the plants that they're growing. So it is, in a way, that kind of relationship kind of evolves more naturally rather than having to be front and center in terms of teaching. But I do think that when we're engaged in regenerative practices that are around non-land-based businesses and you know, people, economies, like Josh says, the invisible stuff, I do think we do need to be really, really visible about unveiling these incorrect worldviews, like the very reductionist mechanistic, you know, the world is a machine, our businesses are machines, we're just cogs in machines in our businesses. It's fundamentally flawed, and it's not how the world works, you know, how nature actually works. But it is the foundation of all of our institutions. You know, our education is built on reductionism, our scientific method is great for, you know, huge amounts of things. And, you know, I'm a product of the health benefits of the reductionist scientific method, but it isn't actually how ecosystems work, complex ecosystems. So we have to have these alternative worldviews that are much more aligned with nature and how nature actually operates.
How do we get better at doing that? So if I was to be intentional about that, saying, right, well, how could I point out the incorrect worldview? How do we get better at improving them practices?
I think raising awareness of that, because it's like a fish swimming in water, isn't it? The fish doesn't know that there's water, and it's exactly the same, that until we actually unveil the way that the world works, take people out in nature so they can actually see how living systems operate, which are, you know, very different from how businesses operate, how our mindsets, you know, even just noticing the seasons and seeing that we don't operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and yet that's what we expect our businesses to do. You know, just having this much more sort of seasonal balance, this observing the natural ebbs and flows, the complexity of nature, that things don't always go to plan, that you can't control things. And I think to a certain extent with permaculture, again, people learn that naturally. You learn when you plant a garden that you cannot control, ultimately. Yes, with the best design plan in the world, you can never control whether, you know, the rain's going to come and wash your seeds out. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you learn that complexity through doing, through having your hands in the soil, and therefore you let go of this need to control everything. Whereas in business, that's quite a different kettle of fish, because you're not generally going to learn that naturally. You really do have to be kind of led there.
One of the things is, so Joshua, you mentioned sort of hospice care for a dying planet, and we know why it's dying, we know what's going on, but there are opportunities in this, and I don't want to be like one of these, there are opportunities, how do we make money off of the collapse of the world around us? But there are opportunities in degraded land repair, young people who can't buy prime farmland because it's priced out beyond the reach of them. You can you can sometimes find degraded land, like I did many years ago. You can find degraded land that has marginal value for what was being done on the land at the time. That degraded, like in the case I bought an old citrus and cattle farm, and citrus and cattle had pretty much messed up the land to the point where you definitely couldn't do citrus and cattle anymore, but you could do something else. We ended up doing agroforestry. So there's these opportunities and sort of that present themselves where regeneration and using you know, practices that are under the umbrella of regenerative agriculture, and certainly in the toolkit of permaculture, provides yields and opportunities for yields that otherwise wouldn't exist. And so that's one of the things to do. When you said hospice care for the planet, why, that felt like a punch in the gut, because I feel that all the time. I feel like I'm just like that, no matter what I'm doing, 50 years is not going to amount to anything. I worry a lot about that. I'm 50. I just had my 58th birthday, so feeling a little old right now. And I'm thinking, like, you know, how much longer can I do this? And who's going to do it after I'm gone? Will anybody be doing this? Anybody going to try and maintain this work? Or will it be being done elsewhere? We have, you know, hundreds of students who've graduated and gone, and some of them are doing it. I had two students, good friends of mine, who just had their farm burned down, because of the escaped agricultural fires from clearing for milpa. And of course, the people who lit the fires, they have no resources to be able to repay that. And what you can repay to build a house. But how do you get the years back involved in creating an agroforestry system? So I don't know. I get a little overwhelmed with this. But which is to say that yes, there are opportunities, particularly for young people right now, who can find these niches that can get repaired and present an opportunity for them to step in and steward that land and kind of manage that transition from whatever was there until what you see behind me. So yeah, so that one of the thoughts I was thinking about the opportunities and in the present for young people who are interested in farming is to look for degraded land and practice regeneration and permaculture.
Yeah, there was a lot in there that what you're saying, Chris, that kind of brought up some thoughts for me. And yeah, so when I was saying the dying off, my hope is that it's not a dying off of the planet. I think it's a dying off of the old way of doing things, right? So like our extractive practices dying off, and then new, the decay of that system sparking new growth and new areas of regeneration. And yeah, it is something that's I'm always constantly thinking of, as well as like, and I see all the time. I see it here in Panama, where you get you could see so things grow so quickly here in a tropical region, and you could see secondary forests like thrive really quickly, right? And it's beautiful just to kind of see within a few years, 10 years or so. It's like amazing. You would think that you were in a primary forest if you didn't understand like the dynamics around it. And for the longest time, when I was taking hikes, I always thought I was in primary forest when I wasn't. I was just in a secondary forest, right? That had been reestablished. But the challenges that I've noticed with people like taking on farms and then, oh, I can't do this, or I don't like living in this climate, and so generationally it just kind of falls on that one generation changes something, and the next generation, well, they don't do that. They chop it all down, and it becomes a cattle farm or something,
Yes.
and it's like, wow, that's crazy. I've seen that happen here in Panama, just in the short time that I've been here, nearly 3 years, right? And so for me, that's like really frustrating, and it's something that I'm always thinking of. And going back to your question of like, how do we, Cormac, how do we kind of move or help foster that change? I think in a lot of ways, it's looking at things multi-generationally in a lot of ways, and it's also helping us to see how do we get back to the right relation to nature in a sense of land, right? How do we get back to the thought of like not owning the land, but being stewards of the land and getting things back into the commons? Really, I think is a huge part of that, right? How do we get land back into the commons? And I think there's a lot of people trying to solve for that problem, but generationally, like if the land is back into a commons and we know that we can't use it in that same way, that everybody has the responsibility to steward that land, similar to indigenous wisdoms that we've seen that was how they were managing their lands, then I think we can start to use that. But it's a different world than it was when the indigenous were in different areas were stewarding their lands, right? So we got to kind of figure out how we mesh the new with the old and come up with where we're at. And that, I think that's the harder part. And I think a lot of that comes down to it's the people problem. It's the governance of one another, and it's being able to collaborate in so many ways. Like how, and that's like, you mentioned that permaculture being more left or having two kind of realms to it, like a left and a right realm.
Just more for me, but yes, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen it. No, I've seen that. Like I see that too. And for me, in a lot of ways, like I think that's part of the challenge that we have, is like we can't collaborate with one another if we're always looking at our differences. And if we could figure out the ways that we can collaborate and understand one another better. So I think in a lot of ways, it's how do we get better at understanding someone that's very not like us, right? And if we can then do that, I think that's a part, because nature understands, that's part of nature's, like, it understands something that it's not, I mean, nature is everything, it's encompassing. So how do we figure out ways that we understand that we are all one thing, that we are all, you know, a part of this one thing, right? And that to me is the greatest challenge, and that's the biggest way that we can move towards better, more regenerative or permaculture designed societies and economies, is by finding out how to understand how connected we are, essentially, right?
Yeah, I want to pick up on as well on that, which is when we talk about regenerative leadership, for example, we're always talking about the inner and the outer journey of the leader. Permaculture can sometimes be really very focused on what you do. So, you know, maybe in permaculture you plant a food forest, or, you know, you design a garden. You know, it's very much about doing. Whereas when you step into that kind of idea of an inner journey and an outer journey, then it's also about who you are and that right relationship, and also valuing diversity, as Josh says. And the other side of the coin is valuing what we have in common and valuing our diversity and uniqueness. So we have to hold those two in balance, that we are all humans, we have so much in common. And one of the biggest things that I hope in future we will all have in common is this desire to create life and create conditions conducive to life, which is kind of the ultimate thing that life does, really. And we need to do that by valuing our own unique part of that, whilst also recognizing our shared humanity and our shared kinship with other non-human living beings as well. So that, you know, that is something that indigenous cultures often have in common, that this idea of kinship with other species. And it's become very taboo in our sort of European, North American, Australasian kind of cultures, because and there is a very strong reason for that. And the reason for that is that if you see the magic and beauty in everything, then that is a threat to those in power who evolved, you know, who kind of came on board over the centuries. That's a real threat to their power. So nature as a kinship force had to be suppressed. So, you know, if we can discover that shared humanity with each other and that shared kinship with other life, then really that is, you know, one of the ultimate driving forces, really. And I think, you know, when we're talking about this kind of conversation, it can be very easy to get bogged down. If, say, you're, you know, somebody out there listening thinking, oh, you know, I'm sitting in my bedroom, I want to do something really great in the world, you know, this all sounds a bit too complicated, you know. Forget the nuances of what is permaculture, what is regenerative, you know, forget all that. Just ask yourself the question, am I creating life, and am I being a good ancestor? There are two questions that you can ask. And if you can answer yes to both of those, then just do it, you know, go out and do it. Because what we really need right now is millions of empowered people doing really good stuff that creates life, asking nature what the solutions are, and actually then going out and creating those solutions. And it will be trial and error, and a lot of them won't work out, but you'll learn for the next time. And that's all part of the evolutionary process. And it's utterly magical if we kind of step into it.
Yep. Sarah, Is there anything left on the topic you think we haven't touched on or discussed before we go to the final thoughts?
That's nice and wide. I mean, we you know, I think it's a topic that will be hot, you know, debated and discussed, you know, probably forevermore. And but I think, you know, I think it is about that richness of both, really. And coming back to what Josh said at the start, use the language that speaks to people. If, you know, if you're speaking to somebody, then avoid that kind of eyes glazing over. If you feel like you can tell a story or use certain words that are going to engage with that person, then, you know, step into that, really. So let's not get too bogged down in the nuances of it, and let's support each other, develop those collaborations, you know, across the different regenerative disciplines. It's something I'm really passionate about doing, and I know Josh is as well, with, you know, the Seeds of Tao community. We've got the Inspired by Nature network in which is primarily a UK focus as well, and, you know, bringing together people so that we can all explore this together, and then bring the tools that we've learned from permaculture and lots of regenerative disciplines into day-to-day lives.
Great. Josh, any final thoughts?
Yeah, sorry, there was an alarm that went off. I'm not sure if you guys heard that. It was probably on mute, I'm hoping, when it went off. Yeah, for me, I think we did cover a huge breadth of topics on. I do want to just maybe chat just a little bit on the need for all of the work that we're talking about here, and even at the same time, I'm kind of maybe pulling a little bit of the Taoist move here of like, we also need to see the greenwash in a lot of ways, because it means that there's actually there's something else being done out there, and we also need to know that that's not maybe the right way to go about it. Or I think it all helps us to move forward, is what I'm saying, right? When we see that there is people greenwashing a movement, I think there's also a moment where we can also see that we're starting to get towards the mainstream of this, and that there is a spectrum in a lot of ways, that most people are not going to. We have very deeply, we've dove in as deeply as we can into this regenerative space in our own ways, right? And so you're going to look at us and you're going to think, well, these guys might be like the purest version of like what you could possibly think of regeneration. Or you're going to look at someone like they really drink the Kool-Aid, right? And then you're going to look at someone that's is just, you know, barely starting to think about these things, or is not even is on the movement spectrum, the penetration curve, I guess you could call it. They're very much on the later laggard side of things, right? And we need all of that to be able to happen for a cultural change and cultural shift. And so I guess what I'm saying is, like, we need sustainability. We need people that are doing the less good, more hospice work. And we also need people that gives them that just gives them the sick feeling in their stomach. Why the heck would we do that? You know, that's the way I feel about it. It's like, let's not do the hospice work. Let's do the transformational work. Let's just not like work on these dying systems and try to make them better. But I think it's important to say that that's all moving us towards a more regenerative future, and we need it all, right? Culturally, and that's kind of the last thing I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And Christopher?
Yeah, all very good thoughts from both Sarah and Joshua, and Cormac, you're mostly quiet because you're coordinating all of this and prompting some thoughtful. Hold on 1 second. Okay, good. Okay, so we have an obligation in the next few minutes. But basically, I think that we're presented with these opportunities. We have to do stuff that's better than what's being done. We have to do something that creates a better future for tomorrow. And everything that we do now that leaves something better than what we encountered and what we found is a good thing. I was a little harsh on the regenerative movement, in part because a lot of it is very individualistic. And permaculture tends to be more cooperative, in my opinion. Although there's bleeds between two, there's shades of gray. So, yeah, but I guess that anybody doing anything out there that's better than the status quo is a good thing. So, and I'd like to say I'm encouraged, but we're in the middle of a pretty bad drought, and this is like the 4th year in a row we've had pretty significant, very hard dry season. So I'm thinking I'm getting fight or flight mechanisms about what I do. Can I maintain this if we get another? We're losing dozens of cacao trees to drought. And that was impossible before. So just nervous for the future. But optimistic. It's nice knowing that there are people like the three of you out there. Encourages me.
Thanks very much.
Can I just end on which is somewhat becoming a bit of a catchphrase of mine, and I repeat it so often, which was I think we need millions and billions of people doing regenerative and permaculture imperfectly rather than a handful of people doing it so-called perfectly. So, wherever you are, just go do it.
Yeah.
Great shout. And the reason I'm so quiet is this isn't really a topic I know much about, so I'm still on that scale, Joshua, of just sort of, I was been in permaculture now, peeking my head above the water to see what else is out there. So I feel a lot wiser from talking to three of you. So thanks very much. Can we just do one more round, just to tell everyone what projects you have gone on, where people can find you? Sorry.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to go first? Yeah.
Yeah, so look up the Think Like a Tree website. So, you can put that into a search engine, it'll come up. We've got the Inspired by Nature network, where I'm actually doing free monthly seedling sessions. So if you've got any ideas and projects that you want to bring along, it's free or pay what you can. And then, kind of bring that along and be nurtured with a group of peers. That's on, you can find that via the website. And then I've got Think Like a Tree and Think Like a Forest courses, depending on kind of what entry level for permaculture and regenerative you want to, what aspect you want to take forward.
Great stuff, Christopher.
My wife and I, we used to host students up until the pandemic, and then the pandemic went away, and we haven't reopened to students because we've gotten really used to working on our own. And part of it, we're more effective now because we don't have to deal with feeding, housing, et cetera, and the dynamics of dealing with people, which is one of the tricky parts of permaculture. So we're just focusing on that, really doing well on that, very fulfilling. We started doing sheep last year, and now my number one job is raising sheep. They outlawed slavery in Belize in 1838, but they didn't take into account sheep farming. So sheep farming keeps me busy. We started these paddocks, and we got the drought. So now I'm doing lots of cut and carry forage, and it's fun. It keeps me busy. I think if I boil it down to how much I'm making doing it, I would probably make more money begging someplace. And so but I enjoy it, and yeah, so that's what's going on with us.
Joshua.
Yeah, so Seeds of Tao is our organization. You can find us on our website. Seeds of Tao is spelled like the Tao Te Ching, so it's TAO, seedsofdao.com. Yeah, I have a few different free programs that you can join. We have a monthly think tank for entrepreneurs where we kind of gather and talk through challenges and work through those challenges of a regenerative entrepreneur. So please join us. That's on the first Wednesday of the month. You can join us there. And then we also have our paid programs as well. We're doing courses in different areas of your business to help you get the skill sets to grow and have a thriving business in the regenerative realm. And then we also have a startup studio as well that's newly released. We don't take on too many clients, but we're looking for specific businesses that's in the regenerative realm that can use growth marketing and growth capital as well. So a specific type of business in that realm. So if you're interested in needing growth capital for a regenerative business, we would love to talk with you and learn more about what you're doing.
That's great. Thanks so
Awesome.
much. And guys, that's been the Permaculture Vine podcast on permaculture and regenerative design. See you all next week. Thanks.
Thank you for having us. Bye. Nice seeing you both, and Cormac, see you next.